Okay, never it's clear to me how long it takes people to come in because the participant
Oh,
number goes up slowly, but give people a moment.
oh, I see. They're coming.
Yeah.
59. Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I am very happy to be back with you tonight for the second session of our Fall Book Talk series. Happy New Year, everybody. Hope you had a wonderful Rosh Hashanah for those of you who celebrate. And as always, please say hello in the chat box. We love to know who's with us. Make sure to chat to everyone. Let us know where you're joining us from tonight. And please also put your questions throughout our conversation in the chat box, and I'll try to weave them into our conversation. A few words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive. We work to expand and transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this work. The book talks are just one piece of the work that we do. So we hope that you will check out jwa.org to explore the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you can click on the button that should be at the bottom of your screen that says CC or show captions, and hopefully that should turn on the captions for you. We can't turn them on for you. Okay, I am delighted to introduce Elizabeth Graver, our author for this evening. Elizabeth's fifth book, Kantika, which we are going to be discussing tonight, was inspired by her grandmother, Rebecca Cohen Baruch Levy. So we'll be hearing more about her. She was born into a Sephardic Jewish family in Istanbul, and her tumultuous and shapeshifting life journey took her to Spain, Cuba, and New York. That's Rebecca, not Elizabeth. The German and Turkish editions are forthcoming. Elizabeth's fourth novel, The End of the Point, was longlisted for the 2013 National Book Award in Fiction and selected as a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And her other novels, Awake, The Honey Thief, and Unraveling, are her other three books. Her story collection, Have You Seen Me?, won the 1991 Drew Hines Literature Prize, and her work has been anthologized in Best American Short Stories, Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and Best American Essays. Elizabeth is the mother of two young adult daughters, and she teaches at Boston College. And we are so delighted to have you with us this evening, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. I love the work you do, so it's a particular pleasure.
Thank you. So I thought we could start with you giving us a short reading just so that those who have not yet had a chance to read the book, and everyone should read the book, it's fabulous, but that those who haven't had a chance yet can get a little taste for the story.
Sure, I'd love to. So, as you said, the book is set in many places, and I'm just going to read a couple pages. Sorry, my voice is a little scratchy. From the very beginning. So it starts in Turkey, in Istanbul, which was called by this community and a lot of other people Constantinople at the time. And I'll hold this up because one of the somewhat odd things about this book for a novel is that I include family photographs. So you can see this family and you can see the little girl with the long kind of stringy pigtails, and that's Rebecca, my grandmother, who is both a fictional character and was a real person. We'll talk about that a little, I'm sure. So the book starts in Constantinople in 1907, and then it eventually moves to Barcelona, to Cuba, and to Queens, New York. And I was saying to Judith before we kind of went live here, I almost feel like it's several different books in terms of how different even the tone is in different places, and it covers 50 years. So you're just getting a little taste here, but I think it's an important taste because there's many things set up in these early pages which are important all the way through and which also drastically change. So I'm going to read 2 pages, but I'm actually, if you happen to be following along, cutting a little bit along the way, so don't kind of get unsettled by that. This, the beautiful time, the time of wingspans, leaps, and open doors, of the heedless, headlong flow from here to there. This, the time before thought, the world arriving not as lists or hearkening back or future tense, but as breath-filled music, cantar, sing. Rebecca sings to the rhythm of the oars as the boat delivers her to school, and in school with the nuns, tournez vos yeux vers Jésus, and climbing ropes at Maccabee gymnastics, hand over hand, and wrap your feet, girls. But what draws her up is less the instructor barking commands or the strength of her limbs than the unspooling thread of her own voice. In wordless tunes, nonsense sounds, ballads, Ladino, French, bits of Turkish, Hebrew, Greek, she sings. As on the street, the lemon man sings lemons, the Bulgarian sings pudding, the vegetable man sings eggplant, squash, and artichokes. Fresh, cheap ladies, how I wait for you with my aubergine. She sings at school in chorus and for daily hymns, and at night her mother sings the children to sleep. Dorme, dorme, querido hijico. Sleep, sleep, darling boy, though two of them are girls. And if the dull-eyed nightingale rarely makes a chirp, still her father stops by its cage most mornings to try to coax it into song, and he sings at synagogue, "You've given me a throat that has not gone dry for calling out to you." And one strange, my throat's going dry for not even singing. Excuse me. And one strange morning after services, he leads Rebecca to the ark, and she sings to the men below and the women above. Her voice is unwavering as the cushioned freedoms and unspeakable good fortune of her childhood. Still, her grandmother sews a banduk bead to the underside of every collar to ward off the evil eye. Their house has 3 stories and is made of stone, which does not burn. Down the slope is Balat, where the poor Jews live, but her family lives at the top of the hill in Fener. Their neighbors Greek diplomats, Armenian doctors, Jewish bankers, and traders like her father. And it is with the daughters of these families and a few equally prosperous Muslim girls that Rebecca and her sister Corinne go to Catholic school. Saturdays wake to sound and light. Later in life, Rebecca will encounter Jews for whom the Sabbath is a solemn davening affair. No apricots in syrup or pomegranates in their bloody pearls, just gefilte fish trembling in slime. Here, too, the meals are prepared ahead of time, and Gatil, the Armenian maid, arrives to start the fire, serve, and wash the dishes, but the children are encouraged to dance and make merry on Shabbat. And in the afternoon, the family visits with relatives or takes a riverboat to the park where the babies nap in a hammock tied to a tree, sometimes several babies to one tree, suspended like pendulous damp fruit. For supper, there's cold fish with lemon and egg and lokum for dessert and toasted melon seed to snack on, and the ball comes out for catch, the tambourine for song. Later, at home, they will light the braided candle, then snuff it with wine and laugh out loud to show the evil spirit that though Shabbat is over, joy remains and has no place for them. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. Quien no risica, no rosica. Whoever doesn't laugh doesn't bloom. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. There's so much in that, just that very beginning, that I want to get to in terms of language and custom and all kinds of things. But the opening is in some ways this kind of like dreamlike, idealized world that Rebecca starts in and then leaves from. And even that first line, "this, the beautiful time," kind of sets that up. But you actually repeat that line a few times throughout the book in different places. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you understood that and where you chose to place it?
Sure. So, I mean, as I think you're picking up on, I was very interested in childhood and in nostalgia. And this is a story of diaspora and having to leave places. So there's a lot of longing and a lot of sense, which I think often people have about their childhood, but particularly, well, it depends on the conditions of the childhood, right? But in this particular case, Rebecca was from a privileged family that had been in Turkey for hundreds of years, having, way back been expelled from Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. But they were very rooted there in a somewhat complicated way, but nonetheless, it was her home. So from everything I read and from visiting Turkey and from talking to my grandparents, who were both from there, my maternal grandparents, it was a life that my grandmother treasured. She loved her. She went to Catholic school, which she loved. She had a very rich and open Jewish community. The family had a lot of money, so they were very comfortable, which was not at all true later. And she's a little girl. So, I mean, there's one line there, I didn't read it, but in this early section that says something like, if there was being bloodshed in the city, parentheses, and there was being bloodshed, she neither saw it nor smelled it, something like that. Because in fact, we're leading up to the Armenian genocide. There was anti-Semitism. It was a complicated society, and it was about to completely fall apart. The Ottoman Empire collapses not that much later, but I was picturing this little girl in this world where she was safe on the streets. I visited that neighborhood. I know my grandmother's address. It's changed radically. It was filled with Syrian refugees, which is incredibly moving to me, right? That this place that was her home was now a place that other people were temporarily trying to find their way in. So I was also just so interested in the layers and in catching this place in that moment. But then I was also, so that phrase, this, the beautiful time, repeats, I think, 2 other times. And I was very interested, without giving too much away, in how Rebecca as a character, and I saw this in my own grandmother, was actually extraordinarily gifted in a way that I find instructive, and I think is harder for me, in finding beauty wherever she is. So it had to be much more of an improvisation later, and it was tinged with sadness. But I think the other time, the last time it comes up in the book, she's in her 50s, her body is aging, she's had a lot of suffering and heartache in various ways, but she's part of this kind of slightly ragtag little synagogue in Cambria Heights, Queens, that's mostly Ashkenazi, so it's not her Sephardic roots, and she's really into it. Like, they have a little theater and they put on shows, which my grandmother really did. I have all these photos of, they called it the 22nd Street Review or something. And she was, in the book, but I think this was true of her in real life, always able to kind of find beauty and joy. She would just notice things. Like, you'd be walking by and she'd be, oh, your hand is so beautiful. She was, or fabric, or she'd take something that she got at she was into yard sales, which I also really am. And she'd find something and turn it into something else. So I was interested in how, on the one hand, nostalgia can work to kind of almost crystallize the past, sometimes in problematic ways, right? In erasing ways. But that certain people, and I guess I aspire to this, are able to find the beautiful time in different ways, right? Not as a pure childhood, not as a play, and even if it's kind of imbued with loss and suffering, or it's very different than the other moments. So I was interested in kind of, I talk about the thread of her voice, and she was in the novel and in life, she was a dressmaker. And I think about kind of what are the things in a story so filled with diaspora and loss and leaving, what are the things that can be carried? And so there are a bunch of them, like song and story and some photographs. But I think this sense of kind of being alert to beauty is something that I see Rebecca, against a lot of odds, actually bringing with her.
And I think you can see that in the story overall. Like, one lens through which to read the book is through the lens of, rupture and refugee, and especially in this moment where there are many refugees in the world and it's a huge problem, and to sort of see this as speaking to that. But you can also look at that first part in Constantinople as also, yes, we know it's coming to an end, and so there's kind of a cloud cast over it, but at the same time, it's also speaking to a time when there actually was an enormous amount of, mixing among different kinds of people and sort of harmonious life side by side. And yes, maybe some of that is a little bit, I can say that because I'm not there and tinged with nostalgia or whatever, but, but also being able to put that particular lens on it and say, maybe there's something hopeful that comes out of that particular moment, even if that moment was not destined to last.
Yeah, no, I do think that the story of the Ottoman Empire welcoming the Sephardic Jews is a story of cohabitation and a very long flourishing period. And I was really conscious of that, given how complicated relations can be now. Yeah.
So you've already referred several times, and I know there's some questions about this already, to the kind of interesting hybrid way in which you approach this, of writing a novel about your family story and kind of bringing in various aspects that were real. So talk a little bit about sort of how you came to this project and how you chose to write it as fiction in this way.
Sure. So this project was a very long time coming in one way, in that I am now 59, and when I was 21, I recorded my grandmother telling stories. So
Mm.
decades ago in college, not for school, just because I loved her. I was interested in her. I was always interested in older people. I used to go actually in high school even to the nursing home and wrote little newspaper articles about, and I was already thinking of myself as a writer too. So I think I had complicated a whole bunch of reasons for wanting to do it. One was just that I wanted her to feel heard, and she was a good storyteller. There's a little video on my website where you can actually hear bits of her voice because I still have the recordings. And I think I also knew it was a really interesting story, but I was very intimidated by it because I didn't speak Ladino. I at that point had never been to Turkey or Spain or Cuba. I was raised in a small New England town in a very kind of culturally Jewish and proud of being Jewish family, but with almost no religious education. So in a million ways, it felt like I just had way too much to learn. And then my grandmother died, sadly, in 1992. And decades went by, and I wrote a whole bunch of other books um, where bits and pieces of her character would show up in various little ways. Or I wrote a poem once, I wrote an essay about going to Turkey with my mother. But it took me until about this book has really took me a long time, almost a decade ago, to feel ready to write it. And I think I was spurred by a number of things. One, the current state of the world, the refugee crisis, then the Trump era, the sense of that. So I teach college, and I have purposefully started teaching a course for first year students who were advanced English language learners. So they're coming from all over the world, and they have incredible stories. Um,
Amazing.
and I'm teaching a lot of immigrant writers. So some Jewish, many not. People like Edwidge Danticat or Viet Thanh Nguyen. There's just so much incredibly powerful writing. So that was part of it, is that I was being nourished by this
Mm.
stuff, and it felt important. But I also, maybe even more centrally, was aware of my own aging and my mother's generation getting older. And I had two uncles who, David and Albert, who were characters in the book, who were alive when I started, helped me a huge amount, especially my Uncle David. I went and spent days with each of them recording
Mm.
them. And my mom, who I think is here tonight, is wonderful and 87, and was kind of, we went to Spain to research the book. So I was aware of, like, okay, there's more stories, and I need to get all the ones I can now, both again, because time's going on and no one lives forever, but also because I actually wanted the people I was writing about to be able to know that I was doing it. So this book is very personal for me, even as I also, it's like I almost could have, the amount of research I did, it felt like writing a dissertation, except that I wrote a novel. Like, I just read so much and had so much to learn, and relied on historians and oral historians and research trips. So, that's why I love that you're in an archive. Like, I love that stuff. I could do it forever. I almost have to cut myself off. So those were sort of the things. And I think I had to write a bunch of other books first, because I felt like this book took a lot of, I needed to be confident enough to be able to kind of dip in. And then I guess the other question, I think somebody in the chat, somebody said I keep getting bounced off. Huh. Are we okay with the tech?
Yeah, I think that probably has to do with that person's connection, unfortunately.
Okay. Just so people know, I'm not reading most of the chat because there's a lot of it, but I
I
glanced
will bring some of the questions in, I promise.
Okay, I want to concentrate, but
Yeah.
so then the question was, do I write it as a novel or as a book of nonfiction? And I think partly because my grandmother was no longer alive and there were a lot of holes, and also because I really, as a writer, love inner life. Like, I just love going inside people's heads, and you have much less liberty to do that with nonfiction. So I chose fiction, but then I did some sort of unconventional things, like included photos and used a bunch of real names. So the book is more hybrid than anything else I've ever written.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that it was harder to write about the people you knew? Some of the people you write about you knew, like your grandmother, your uncles, but then you also write about her parents, for example, who you didn't know. Did you find it harder to write about the people you knew or those that you didn't know?
Harder to write about the people I knew.
Hmm.
Yeah, harder to write about the people who are still alive, actually. And that was partly because there were so many stories and I could keep getting more information. So there were no boundaries in a way. And I rewrote the last chunk of the book radically. I spent 2 more years after I had a through line through the book, where I had really chapters I was fond of. One from the point of view of a character based on my mother in college at Queen's College in 1957, when she was a kind of leftist, bringing socialist speakers. Like, they were interesting, but they didn't. It just started. It was like a family tree that started sprouting in every direction.
Hmm.
And when I hadn't written about Luna, my Aunt Luna, in that earlier version. So yes, I think, to me, I mean, what surprised me at the beginning was Alberto, really, who was my great grandfather. I did not expect to go into his point of view. I'd never met him. My mother never met him. My uncles met him knew him when they were very little. And so that was genuinely fiction. I knew about 5 things about him, which were
Hmm.
interesting things: that he was a bad businessman, that he adored gardening, that he'd had a first marriage and run off to England for 10 years so he'd get divorced. They were kind of dramatic things, but I didn't know anything about his inner life. I had photos, and he just took over in some way that I felt so compelled by his character, because he was had partly to do that he was old and he just loved Istanbul. Like, that's where he was from. And so the transition for him to Barcelona, which was a very weird place for Jews to go, right, at the time, and because it was the place that had expelled them, was much harder than it was for his daughter. So that had to do with kind of, I fictionalized, but I think it had partly to do with just imagining someone in his age and having had his life experiences, if that makes sense.
Well, we've talked about the photos, and you sent me a couple to share, which I would love to bring up because I think it is always wonderful to see some pictures, and then we can talk a little bit about, I'm going to share my screen. We can talk a little bit about why you chose to use them and sort of how you selected them. And I think part of what's interesting is, like, the photos. I loved seeing the photos in the book, and part of it is I love photos. I love primary sources. I'm a historian, and I love to see what you can read in these. And of course, like, on some level, they represent, like, the real as opposed to what you fictionalize. But then, of course, photos themselves are, can be a form of artifice. They represent something real, but they're also a way of presenting oneself. So how did you think about that piece of it?
I was fascinated by that, and I was also fascinated by how photos function inside the actual book as kind of passports or legal documents, or as things that people use to get a husband, or as things that they use to think about their body, questions about gender and women, and later in the book, ability and disability. So in this photo, Rebecca's young, she's beautiful, she's wearing this pretty kind of Eastern looking getup.
Right, almost like a costume, maybe. Do you
It
know what it
almost
was
looks like
from?
I don't actually know. I kind of assume that she made it because she never stopped sewing and she was very fanciful. I can show you if you want when we get back. I have a doll that I made together with her,
Mm.
dressed in the old lace baby dress that she made for her dowry. So she was a performer, and I think you can sort of see that here. And her clothing is interesting in that it does not signal West. And in the next photo in the book, when she's in Barcelona, she looks extraordinarily like a kind of French lady. So I was interested in kind of both kind of culture, ethnicity, kind of how the photos seem to be, what they seem to be presenting. I don't know exactly, like, would this be seen as Sephardic? Would it be seen as Turkish? I don't know. It looks like some sort of folk costume.
Hmm.
Um, but I also was really interested in her gaze, which I think is kind of provocative and very strong and a little inscrutable.
Hmm.
Um, and she has on this nice jewelry, but she's sort of looking. I don't know. How would you describe that gaze?
Yeah, well, it's more her stance to me. Like, she looks very kind of strong and has some attitude, and you know, looks proud.
Yeah, she was a very dignified person at every
Yeah.
stage. And I also just love, I mean, you talk about archives, the materiality. So I love all the little cracks. Um,
Hmm.
and some of the photos have writing on the back. There's one incredible one that didn't make it into the book, that's her 2 children And oh, my mother has saying something. This is my mother's favorite photo. Hi, Mom. Um, uh, there was one that didn't make it into the book that was Rebecca flanked by her two sons as little boys, and they're wearing. It's taken in Spain. She had to leave her sons in Spain, as you see in the novel, to go have an arranged marriage in Cuba and then America, and the photo was taken in Spain, but the boys are wearing little sailor suits that she must have made for them and that say US on the patches. And then on the back, because I'm sure she took the photo with her, having to leave her children behind, and it took her a really long time, this has echoes with our current world, to get them over because of legal stuff. It says in English, which she was just learning, there in Spain, my darlings, and there is spelled wrong, THERE, and darlings is spelled DOLLINGS, like with a New York accent, right?
Darling, yeah.
They're in Spain, my darlings, and that broke my heart, right? And I also thought it was really interesting that she put them in US sailor suits, because the way I imagined it was that this was the photo she sent to her potential American husband, who was my grandfather, had migrated but was already a citizen. And she was already turning her kids into Americans. So they're just so rich. And as you say, they're artifices in a way. They're being used, right?
Mm-hmm. So let's look at the next one, which is of your Aunt Luna, who's a really important and interesting figure in the book, because she has cerebral palsy. And so you're talking about disability and the body and, parenting and expectations and sort of how you navigate all of that in a time when disability was a whole different thing than it is now.
Right. So Luna was in real life and in the novel my grandfather's, Sam's biological child, and my grandmother's stepdaughter. They each came into their marriage they each lost spouses and came into their marriage with children. And Luna was born with cerebral palsy, and her mother eventually died giving birth to another child who also died. So there was an enormous amount of loss. And then there was yet another baby who had died. So when my grandmother showed up, Luna was about 5 and was very loved by her family, but couldn't do anything, couldn't walk, her speech was incomprehensible. She was in diapers. And there was a sense of kind of the family tending to her and adoring her, but that there was nothing that could be done to help her achieve independence. And Rebecca, who had, interestingly, in Sephardic families, there's often someone who's designated the healer, and taught things by the prior generation, a woman. And my grandmother viewed herself as that, and she was incredibly good with bodies and kind of, someone put unflinching in terms of her gaze. She was unflinching. Nothing stopped her. So she took it upon herself to help Luna. And in the novel, as in real life, it was quite complicated because a lot of what she did was kind of tough love. And the family was very protective of Luna. But Rebecca never lost hope and just saw her as a full human and was like, I'm going to keep working with you. But what interested me in the novel was kind of playing with Rebecca, as you can see, was quite beautiful and used surfaces in her looks. Like she needed to survive, but she would kind of flirt her way through things and perform and she was very shape-shifting, dressed to look one way or dressed to look another. And Luna couldn't do all of those things because of her disability. Her body would not allow her those things. And I have Luna kind of as a lens watching Rebecca, so that when Rebecca says to Luna, just let people see what you're like underneath, and Luna, who's very bright, thinks kind of sharply, yeah, you say that, but like you will not leave the house without looking in the mirror, and you look in your reflection everywhere you go, and there are no pictures of me on the wall. So I used them to kind of, I really wanted to explore complexity. I was interested in blended families in this context of migration, but also in bodies and embodiment, and in kind of what child can teach a parent and what a mother can teach a child. And so in this picture, I fictionalize what it was used for. I don't really know, but in the novel, it's being used as a photo for Luna's new school. But I was interested here in how she looks also kind of proud. She's sitting, she's posing, she's very well dressed.
Right, and sort of flirty also.
Yeah, and she was an incredibly charming person. She also sadly died before the book came out, but she was a force, like Rebecca. She was in her old age, she wrote for the Sun Sentinel in Florida about disability. I mean, she was an astonishing person. She got awards at the end of her life from the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, but she was up against incredible challenges being born in that era where mostly kids like her were essentially put into institutions. So I was interested in here and how, on the one hand, it reminded me of the painting Christina's World in
Mm-hmm.
terms of its pose. So that's in the novel. But how, on the one hand, you can see echoes with Rebecca, but it's also like a candid. It's a little blurry. Her hair is doing something really wacky, And as someone myself who doesn't particularly like being photographed and I'm not someone who sort of seeks a gaze in that way. I never have been. I'd probably align more with her. But I guess I was really interested in. So in the book, they go to take this photograph, and Luna's kind of thrilled because it's the first one that ends up on the wall, but also very aware at various points of sort of clashes with Rebecca.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is really interesting to think about what it means to save certain pictures and to use them in different kinds of ways. And I wonder also, what was it like to try to write about disability from in a different historical period, sort of in a historical way?
Challenging. Again, I did a lot of reading. I was very, the question of what language to use is very tricky because, on the one hand, language has evolved in incredibly useful and good ways. And on the other hand, I'm not going to call the school Luna attended the school for disabled, it was called, I even hesitate to say the word out loud, but the school for crippled children, right? That's what it was called. So
Right.
I felt like, in order to write historical fiction and be kind of true to the period, I had to employ some of that language. Otherwise, it would have just been anachronistic. But at the same time, I, in my acknowledgments, kind of talk about how the language has shifted. And then, I was very aware, as I am with every detail I write, really, of wanting to both fully imagine a character who's her own self and who's not some kind of typecast character, like who's got complexity, but also be true to the extent that I can to her conditions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it was really interesting because my real Aunt Luna had a son who sadly died at a young age, but his name was Carl. And I always thought that was a little bit of a weird name for a Jewish kid, like it was with a C. It was like, why'd she name him Carl? And I never knew. No one ever knew. They actually called him Stormy for some reason. But as I was doing research, I knew that from a recording, from the interviews with my grandmother, that Luna had been seen by a doctor at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital who was himself in a wheelchair. And my grandmother describes him and says he was a handsome man who was in a wheelchair, and we'd go once a month and they charged us $25, and I could do much better with her. She had a whole thing about it. So when I was doing research, I found a book by a man called Dr. Carlson called Born Like This, and he had cerebral palsy, and he started the first clinic in the United States for kids with cerebral palsy, and he was in a wheelchair, and the era was the same. And so suddenly I was like, I bet, I'll never know, but I bet she named her son Carl after her doctor. So those were the sorts of things where I wasn't reading to look for my family's story, but and the book was incredibly moving and interesting and kind of gave me insight into what that era was like and how groundbreaking this particular man was to be doing this work and also to be himself disabled doing this work.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it also just, this is a side point, but it speaks to the ways in which the research process can be so random. It's like you can be very organized about how you do research, but sometimes it's like making these connections that you could very easily miss if you aren't thinking with the right kind of lens.
Oh, and I love those little gifts. Like, that's the fun of it, right? Is when suddenly
It feels like such a
oh my God, I
treasure.
wasn't looking for that, but yeah, that's
Right.
that's why I could do it endlessly. Yeah.
So I want to get to some of the questions in the chat. I have lots of other questions, which we'll get to hopefully, but there were some questions about your grandmother going to Catholic school and sort of why that was, and also how that influenced her Jewish identity.
So I think she went to Catholic school because her family was upper class, and that was the best school, a school called Lycée Notre Dame de Sion that still exists. The some of you probably know this. The Jewish community at the time in Turkey was educated in French. They spoke Ladino or Judeo-Spanish at home, but there had been this big movement from some, I don't know, minister of education to educate that community in French. So my grandfather, Sam, who grew up very poor in Istanbul, went to a school called Alliance Israélite that was also um, in French, but he had to drop out after fifth grade. My grandmother went to a fancy school. It's where Ataturk sent his daughters eventually. And interestingly, it's a school that was founded by a Jewish convert to Catholicism, and it was very progressive. So it was Catholic. I've been to it. There's statues. My grandmother always loved Jesus. She would actually talk about, like, she'd compare her little son, her baby Albert, who was blonde. She'd say he was fat and beautiful like baby, and blonde like baby Jesus. Why is
Right,
baby
Jesus was
Jesus have to be,
definitely blonde. Yeah.
blonde, right? That's another issue. But but she liked Christianity. She quite did. Not in Spain when she had to send her kids, tried to send her kids to Catholic school there. There it was didn't work at all. It was a different
Mhm.
version of it. But it was interesting for me because I teach at a Jesuit college too, you know. But it was a school that would give the Jewish kids Jewish education and the Catholic kids. So it was a pretty interesting place. But I think more than anything, to me, the way she talked about it, it signaled that she had had an upper class childhood, and then it all fell apart. So
Mhm.
it's just a beautiful school. The nuns were kind of very nurturing. She talked about how they would bathe her feet and braid her hair, and there was tons of art there, which she loved. And so it the fact that it was Catholic, it was a very mixed society in certain ways. It wasn't. They weren't supposed to marry non-Jews. I'm not sure they had them in their homes, but in the streets, in commerce, in the neighborhood where she lived, which is way up on the hill above the main Jewish neighborhood, Balat, it was upper class. And so that class, I was really interested, especially because my grandfather was lower class,
Mhm.
um, in how class played out. And it had partly to do, I think, with why my grandmother did not want to live in a Sephardic neighborhood in New York, because that was his family and there were a lot of tensions.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, and that's part of what's so beautiful about this book is that it is this glimpse into American Jewish immigration that is not the stereotypical story. And there's a few places where you talk about her missing some of the Jewish traditions of her childhood, but then also, as you say, choosing, to be in other spaces. How do how did you think about, and how did your family kind of navigate that encounter? Um, and how did you think about that for the book?
Which encounter? The
Between like Sephardi heritage and American what we might call Ashkenormative
I mean, in
Jewish
my
culture.
own life, my father was Ashkenazi, so for me, it played out in the differences and similarities between my two sets of grandparents, but mostly the differences. And I know,
Mhm.
my mother talks about when she met my father. First, they were just very relieved because she was like an intellectual and already 24 and unmarried. That, like, she'd come home with a guy and he was Jewish, but his his family didn't know what to make of her at all. Like, she didn't speak Yiddish. She didn't need that. They had
Right.
no idea. She didn't seem Jewish. They ended up loving her because she's wonderful. But I think, I don't really know. I was kind of having to imagine, but I think there were, there were some kind of more bigger Sephardic communities in, like, Spanish Harlem for a while, and in the Bronx. And my grandmother's sister lived in one, but then she had more money and she moved. A lot of it had to do with money. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that my grandmother really wanted a garden, and land. And that's a really strong theme in the novel. Both she and my grandfather were gardeners. I'm a gardener. My mother's, we're all gardeners. And so you couldn't have that in the Bronx, right, as easily. But I also think somehow it was interesting. I did an event the other day with that in a virtual event, but in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, my uncle Frank, my mother's youngest brother, came. And he said about her, she never tried to fit in. She did not care. That wasn't how she operated. He said Sam was incredibly conscious of not fitting in. He was
That's
worried
her
about,
husband. Yeah.
right, seen as an immigrant. He was worried about his accent. He told his kids, my mother has memories of him saying, "You may not speak Ladino anymore. You may not call me Papa. You may never get your ears pierced." Like he was almost sort of more conventional of that era, assimilation oriented.
Mhm.
She made her home wherever she wanted to, but she did not want to live with his family because they thought she was snobby and rich and they were tense about Luna and there were just all kinds of things. And I think his family was in a more Sephardic neighborhood.
That's interesting. Right. It's very interesting how the class piece and the culture piece were at kind of cross purposes in some
Yeah.
ways.
But she had her community. She loved her sisterhood. You know, she
Right.
loved her synagogue. Like she was into it all. So she had a Cuban man across the street who wasn't Jewish and she would sing with him. So she was very piecemeal
Right.
about
She
it.
found her ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I want to talk a little bit about language because you're writing about people who spoke so many languages and who moved between languages. And so what was that like? I mean, and you've already said you didn't speak Ladino. So, what of the languages, how did you figure out how to bring them in? You weave in a lot of Ladino sayings. Were those things that your family used? Did you have to learn them? Kind of what was your process for how to bring the language in? And there was someone in the comments who said that you did a great job with the Ladino. So kudos.
It was hard. So for the Ladino, I didn't speak it. My mom and my grandfather, people would say like little prayers after a meal, but I didn't speak it. They would speak it over my head. And they called it Spanish. And of course, my grandmother had lived in Spain for 10 years. My grandfather had lived in Cuba and Mexico. My grandmother was in Barcelona, where there was also Catalan. So they didn't really care what anything was called. They didn't use the word Sephardic really. You know, they were just like Spanish or Espanol or our Spanish. So I just thought they were talking above my head, and I studied French, and I would speak French with my grandmother, who was fluent. You know, we could just go. I love speaking French. So in writing the book, French helped me a little, and it actually helped me in Istanbul. I went to the Sephardic home for the aged and did interviews, and a couple of them were in French. So, and my grandfather's cousin's wife, when I was there, my mother spoke Ladino with her when we visited years ago, and I spoke French because she didn't speak English. But for the book, I sat in on a Ladino class at Tufts. Have you ever met Gloria Asher? There's a wonderful older woman who teaches Ladino, or at least did teach it. And then but it was really hard. I mean, the students all spoke Spanish and they were 19 and my brain was a sieve compared to theirs. So I can't say I got very far. So then I just, did research, and there's a wonderful professor at Stanford named Aaron Rodriguez. I wrote to him out of the blue, asked him for help. He's from that community and is a historian. He helped me, a guy named Brian Kirshen at SUNY Binghamton. The internet was my friend here. And I don't know if you know the work of Sarah Aresti. She's a singer, and she does these beautiful she has her little daughter doing these little Ladino lessons. So I'm picking it up, and I actually am still interested in it. But for the book, I kind of used it. It was very important to me, the multilingualism, because I think it's beautiful and a gift of this community. And at the same time, I was always really conscious, especially with my grandmother, of the losses. And I'm conscious of how Ladino's dying. I mean, there are these efforts and they're wonderful, but it is not a mostly living language. Devin Narr, who teaches at University of Washington, is raising his kids in it. I was on Zoom with him and I heard him. I was like, "Are you speaking Ladino?" He said, "Yeah, that's what we do." But like them and who else, especially in the U.S. But so I wanted all of those crossings, but I also didn't want to drive my readers mad, and I also didn't want to make mistakes. So it was a question of kind of, where do you do it? When do you translate? I was interested in moments of confusion. There's a whole scene in Barcelona where Rebecca's kind of stuck between Catalan and Castilian and Ladino, because there's all these overlaps and then all there's differences, and you sort of give yourself away as Jewish if you're speaking like Cervantes, basically, right? So she's kind of trying to pass, and it doesn't work, and she's sort of stunned by the whole thing. So language is so political, it's so historical, and then for me as a writer, it's so beautiful. So I loved just, someone I think in the chat had said, why Kantika? So it means song. And I was really so happy that my editor let me go with this title, because I thought she might not, because most people don't know what it means.
Right.
But I was really interested in having a title where most readers, a few readers would be like, oh my God, Kantika, but most would be like, what does that mean? It sounds like canticle or cantar, but you're a little bit of a language outsider for a minute, and that's what it's like to be an immigrant, right? And at the same time, the word cantica means song, and it has a beautiful sound and a really funky, cool spelling. And so I actually liked how, if you don't know what it means, the sound moves forward in a way, right? Like it's kind of sound over sense, and until you go in, and then you have to learn. So I thought about it in a lot of different ways. I tried not to translate directly all the time. Sometimes I let the reader be a little bewildered or figure it out from context.
Right. And you have this one scene where I forget, I think Sam and maybe your mom are trying to translate something from Ladino. Yeah. And there's a word that they're like trying to figure out, and they can't quite, and they're like, well, in Hebrew it means this, and in French it means this, and in Turkish it means this, and your grandmother's like, whatever, it's the word,
Right. Yeah. And I made that up, but that was the sort of thing she would say. Just like, who cares, people? Like, just it's like, it's a sound. Like, just go. You don't need to fix everything. You can be fluid. Like, that was one of the things that I loved about her. She wasn't boxing things in,
Yeah. There was a question, speaking of which, about the fictionalization of, can you say a little bit about what you chose to fictionalize and what you didn't fictionalize, and how you made some of those decisions?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big question. I used everything I knew, basically. So the main events in the book, the different migrations, pretty much when they happened, and I found a lot. I found like ships manifests, and I have passports. My family, for a family that moved around so much, saved an incredible amount of stuff. So I had, I had my Uncle David and Albert's passports from Barcelona, which, even though they were born there, said they were Hebrew Turkish. They never got citizenship, which is pretty striking, and that Spain had supposedly invited back the Sephardic Jews.
Right.
And that was part of the reason they had so much trouble getting into the US, because there were these punitive laws in 1924 that kept out Turks and Jews, basically, and a lot of other people.
Right.
So if I knew it, I put it in. All the central characters, almost all the central characters, I used real names with the permission of the ones still living, which was sort of just a nod to myself and my family, but it also did in a way feel like important historically, in a way, like that these were in fact real people. I am inventing a lot. But then other people like Gentile Nehan, who is Alberto, the character based on my great-grandfather's first wife. I made up her name. I don't know the real name. Rahelika, who is Luna's birth mother. I did not use her real name, partly because it was Suzanne and I had too many Suzannes, but partly I felt a little protective of writing about people who were in fact relatives, but I don't actually know, like they're, so there were, basically, if I felt like I could honor somebody and do it in a way that was with their permission, I would use a real name. If I felt like I had enough material to build a scene, I would do it. But then I went inside people's heads. My editor at one of my first events said to me, how do you write about your grandparents having sex so well? Like, oh my God. But like, that's a liberty I took, right?
Right.
Like, I knew they had a very affectionate and passionate relationship. You could see it, but God help me, I wasn't ever in the bedroom with them, right? So, as a fiction writer, like, you go there.
Right. And in terms of the research process, I mean, you've talked a little bit about how you did that, but I think I was struck particularly because you're writing so much about female characters, and we know that the historical record is often very thin when it comes to women's experiences. So, I mean, you've said that your family luckily saved things, but what was your approach for sort of figuring out how do we even go about you know, creating the details of daily life, especially for women and from women's perspectives?
Partly I relied on some incredible historians. So, there's a woman who teaches at UCLA named Sarah Abrevaya Stein, who's written this book called Sephardi Lives. I mean, I love kind of like material culture, material history. I mean, I think if I hadn't been a novelist, I would have been, I don't know, done some kind of ethnographic stuff or journal, long form journalism. So I just love that stuff. So Sarah has a um, article, whom I've never met, but we've corresponded now, called something like Rue or Ruda, a plant's eye view of the diaspora, where she talks about that herb.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very much about what's people have been writing an interesting way about women's Sephardic women's lives. There's not enough written by those women, although interestingly, a lot of the kind of refrains and the songs and the stories seem to be passed down. Ladino was partly, it was a liturgical language, but it was largely a language of the home, right? So there is this sense of those things having come through a female line and being kind of filled with instruction, and you can glean a lot from them. Sarah Aresti talks about this too. They're very simple, so they can be repeated and carried across
Mm-hmm.
migration. Um, but again, as a fiction writer, I'm making a lot up, but I also, in my particular family, and I don't think this is that unusual, my grandmother, not my grandfather, was the storyteller. So she didn't write. He was much, actually, for someone who, people are putting such interesting things, wrote a book on my father. I'm sorry. Um, uh, he only had a fifth grade education, but was an autodidact, loved to read, was kind of an intellectual monkey. She wasn't. She was very embodied. She read her French Bible from her high school. I have it. And she read the Psalms. She read religiously, but she didn't read. She would never have been a writer. She wasn't interested in me being a writer. She was interested in me being sort of an artist, like in some bigger way. And I did actually love to draw and paint too, which I would do with her. So, but she was a storyteller and she was incredibly open. And that was another thing that I think you can see in the book, but that really interested me, is that there weren't any taboos with her. So she would talk to me about sex and bodies and disability and pain and suffering and joy and beauty. And he would not have my grandfather. He was very dignified and he'd had a very painful childhood. His father had run off and left them and had disappeared and started another family. So I think I would have had a really hard time and felt like I was kind of trespassing. So it felt like a woman's story in that way. But I also have point of views with male characters. And my
Right.
Uncle David was a huge talker and very
Mm-hmm.
psychological. And so I didn't feel like in every way I wanted the book to be kind of kaleidoscopic. Like I didn't want it to be a singular story, but Rebecca is obviously the like very strong through thread.
Yeah.
But there are two male point of view characters in it too. So
So you end the book in 1950. Why did you choose to end it there?
well, that was another thing I kept playing around. So it ended in 1957. It had chunks of a granddaughter interviewing her grandmother that were set
Mm-hmm.
in the 90s, and I kept pulling them out. It was really hard to figure out where to end it, because in real life, here we are, right? Like it's an accordion; it just keeps going. Thank God. But um, and I don't want to give away too much, but I think for people who haven't read it, I decided to end it at a kind of cusp moment of generational shift, right? The sort of passing from one generation to another. And I was also interested in Rebecca being 50 and sort of half a century middle age. Um, it could have ended somewhere else. I mean, I did kind of at some point just have to tell myself to stop. A couple people have said, is there going to be a sequel? I'm like, I don't think so, but I have plenty of material, but I don't think so.
What is your next project, if you
So
don't mind me?
I'm in very, very early. I've been very busy with this book and other things, but I'm in early stages of actually thinking about my father's family,
Mm-hmm.
maybe in something that would be nonfiction. I can't. I don't want to say much more, but
Mm-hmm.
um, I do love this kind of digging into the past. But I also had an interesting relationship with him where we did a lot of writing back and forth, and so I'm I'm playing at this point.
Hmm. It's interesting that you would think about writing a different part of the family story as nonfiction as opposed to as fiction.
Yeah, I think if I do this project, and I'm not even sure I will, it would have more of myself in it.
Mhm.
And therefore I have better access.
Mhm. Right. That does make it easier. You can fill it in more easily yourself.
Right.
Um, Maybe as a last question, obviously one of the major themes in the book is about home and leaving home, but also recreating home. And there's the interesting piece also about like returning to Spain, a place they've never been. Is that something that was kind of discussed openly in your family, or was it just sort of in the, in the ether because of their particular immigration paths?
Was it discussed what it means to return to Spain?
No, just sort of the
Or-
overall the sense of like what it means to be at home somewhere or to create home,
Oh,
where home was.
I think it was probably more in the ether, but I think I was very alert to the ether. I mean, I was very conscious of the fact that my grandmother kept so many things. Or here, I'll show you. Let me grab my doll. I grew up sort of knowing. So this is Rebecca that we made together, but
Oh,
her
wow.
dress is this sort of extra. I don't know if you could see, but incredibly beautiful silk lace baby
Mm,
dress. And my grandmother kept everything, and she had tissue paper, and she would take things out, and they were always from somewhere, and some of it was even like jewelry from Mexico, or at one point they went to Israel, she had things from there, but she had things from her diary, she had photographs, and so I guess and yet she lived a very modest life. When I knew her, they lived in Central Florida in a little town called Beverly Hills, in a teeny little ranch house, but they loved their garden, and she had these trunks and drawers and closets, and so I was always aware that she was from somewhere else. I was confused when I was little because she would say she was Spanish,
mm.
and then she would say she was Turkish, and I didn't know about anything at that point. I was just like, is she? And then I knew she was Jewish, but she didn't seem Jewish like the other grandmother at all. They didn't keep kosher. It just all seemed, all the food was different. So mostly, I think what I felt was a mix of sort of richness and confusion, but also a sense of loss, like a sense
Mhm.
of that everything's wrapped up carefully and there's not that much of it, and she cherishes it. And then my mother told me more. So the kind of heartbreak that my grandparents, my mother's grandparents, that my Rebecca's parents never made it to America, and that she was separated from them. And so those things I grew up kind of slowly learning. But no, I don't think we would sit around and talk about what's home and how you make a home. Mostly I was struck by how they did. You know,
Mhm.
they would take us out to pick the oranges on their trees, and they were, they had a good life, but there was always some sense in a way of not being inside as full a community as they might have been, I guess.
Mhm. But it brings us back to where you started, which is your grandmother's ability to kind of find beauty where she was, which is such a piece of, I think, how people figure out how to make a place that might not exactly be home feel home-like, or, a kind of stand in some way.
Yeah, and she made a big effort. She never learned English that well, and she was self-conscious about it, but she took pleasure in things. So she would love the little phrases. So she'd say, I'd come in the morning like barefoot in my nightgown, and she'd say, good morning, Miss America. Or she'd say, don't be a wise guy. And so even things like that, I was always aware, as someone who was always interested in language, and like there was something like a little different, and it was both pleasure and estrangement in a certain way.
Mhm.
It
Right.
had all of that in it.
Right. And you could see her trying, but also in her trying, you know, not quite getting it, but
Right.
making it her
It
own.
was often a little off, but it was like a very valiant effort, and she had a good sense of humor, so it was often funny.
Right. And then it becomes sort of part of someone's style, right? Like it becomes their own. It might not be the catchphrase, but it's her catchphrase or
That's right.
whatever.
There you go. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing your book and your family story with us. I hope everyone will go out and read it. It's really beautiful. And as Jenny, my colleague's been putting some links in the chat, there's always more to learn at JWA. You can, in our encyclopedia, read about Jewish women in Turkey in the Ottoman and post-Ottoman period. You can read about women and Sephardic music and Sephardi and Mizrahi women in the US. On our podcast, we did a story reported from Istanbul about a Jewish woman named Karen Sarhon, who's working to keep Ladino and its culture alive. And I also want to say, let everyone know to stay tuned, because on October 2nd, we are going to launch a new online portal to our whole oral history collection on our site. And that includes many interviews of Jewish women of Sephardi heritage from our Weaving Women's Words Seattle project. Many women from Turkey came, and Rhodes and other places came to Seattle. So there are wonderful stories there to explore. Our next book talk will be 2 weeks from tonight, Thursday, October 5th, a conversation with Maddie Kahn, the author of Young and Restless, The Girls Who Sparked America's Revolutions. And this is going to be the first event in our year-long celebration of the 10th anniversary of our teen fellowship, the Rising Voices Fellowship. So I hope that you will join us for this multi-generational conversation. And until then, wishing everyone a Shana Tova and a Gmar Chatima Tova, a Happy New Year, and may everyone be signed and sealed for a sweet and healthy new year. Thank you all, and good night.
Thanks so much, Judith. This was such a pleasure. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.